Welcome. In this session we will look at how to create and discover a data source. We will introduce the concept of entities and attributes, preview the database schema that will be used in this video, create and discover an MSSQL data source, and give other roles access to the new data source. Fraxes connects to the data source and presents the entities and attributes within it. Entities refers to the data in the data source, such as tables, while attributes refers to the organization of data in the data source, such as columns in a table. This is the schema for the default Fraxes Chinook SQL data source, which you will be investigating in this video. It is a SQL Server relational data source. Notice that entities, for example, artist, album, and track, are the data source tables, while the attributes like artist ID, album ID, and track ID within them are the columns within the tables. There are several steps that must be completed when creating and discovering a new data source. Firstly, the data source properties are added. Then the values must be entered for the data source parameters. Once the data source connection is tested, the data source can be discovered, and other roles granted access to the data source. The final step is to view the data source entities, attributes, and relationships, but this item will be discussed in a separate video. So let's get to it. To begin, log into Legoz using valid user credentials that grant access to the relevant organization. Note that to manage data sources, your user profile must include permissions to access the data sources menu item. On logging in, expand the Legoz menu option by clicking on the down arrow next to it. Select the Data Sources menu option to open the Data Sources screen. At the top of the grid, you will see buttons to create and delete data sources, as well as buttons to discover a data source, validate a data source, test its connection, and view its entities. Note that the Create button is enabled by default, allowing you to initiate the creation process, while the remaining buttons are disabled until you select a data source from the grid. As you explore the grid, you will notice the Clear All Filters option, which allows you to reset any previously applied filters, ensuring clarity in your data source view. Let's create a new data source. Click on the Create button, and the Create Data Source modal will appear. Should you decide to cancel the setup process, simply click the Cancel button to return to the previous screen. To proceed, ensure that you fill in all mandatory fields, which are indicated by a red asterisk. Complete the data source code. Note that the first character of the data source code may not be a number, and special characters, with the exception of an underscore, may not be used. Add the data source description. The type refers to the data source type you are creating, and should correspond to the relevant data source connector. In this example, we are creating an MSSQL data source, therefore the MSSQL option is selected from the type drop-down. Note that the push-down algebra box is ticked by default. The Spark tick box on the type drop-down links to the Create Views Only tick box on the main screen, and is only used when discovered tables are to be created as views rather than tables for the same Spark instance on which Fraxes is running. When all mandatory information has been entered, the Save and Continue buttons become enabled, allowing you to continue with the data source setup. In this example, click the Save and Continue button. To connect to a data source, Fraxes needs to understand the connectivity parameters for each data source. In this video, the focus is on an MSSQL data source type. However, there are over 200 data source types you can connect to. These include the following 8 included in the base configuration: CSV, Excel, JSON, REST API, MS SQL, MySQL, Oracle, and Postgres. Each data source might request a different set of parameters to establish its connection with the source. For example, here are the parameters requested for MS SQL, while these are the parameters for an Oracle data source. Data source parameters are pre-configured when the data connector for the associated data source type is created. Refer to the master data, Data Connectors video for instructions on creating data connectors. The system already knows that you want to connect to a MSSQL Data Source, which in turn requires the specification of the server IP address, port number, and database name. The data source credentials, namely the username and password, also need to be specified. The values supplied in the data source parameter fields are user-defined. The ones used in this video have been obfuscated for data privacy purposes. Note that should the login or address change on the data source, you need to also make these changes in the Frax's data source parameters and rediscover the data source. In this example, select the Save button. The next step is to test the data source connection to ensure the parameters that were entered are correct. To do this, filter for the relevant data source in the grid. Select the data source. If you are the owner of the data source, in other words the person who created it, the Test Connection button will become active. If you are a user who only has view access to the data source, you will not be able to test its connection or discover it. Click the Test Connection button. A green confirmation message will confirm the connection. If the connection failed, details of the error will be presented on screen, highlighted with a red border. Now let's discover the data source. When you first create your data sources, the entities and attributes could be discovered for you when you select the Discover button. The Discover Entities pop-up window will appear, which by default will discover all the entities within the data source. This screen is used to interrogate the data source to find the entities and attributes which reside within it. You can decide if you want to manually specify the entities and attributes for your data source, or if you want the system to do a full discovery for you. The Discover All Entities checkbox should remain checked to enable full auto discovery. If you uncheck it, you can manually specify the entities to interrogate via the code and schema fields. If the data in your data source is extensive, you might want to consider manually creating only those entities that you need, instead of using the Discover All Entities option. This is because the data source might be extremely complex or very large, which could affect the duration of the discovery process and impair performance. However, in this example the data source is relatively small, and so we will discover all the data. Click on Save and Discover. The modal will close, and the data source screen will display. Click the Discovery Progress icon for the newly created data source. The View Discovery Progress modal will show the list of entities which have been discovered, as well as a count of how many entities were discovered. It is considered good practice to build a routine discovery and update procedure for new and existing data sources, entities, and attributes into your data maintenance plan. This is because the system will not automatically search for or create these without your authorization. For example, should new tables, attributes, or columns have been created in your data source after the initial configuration, these will not become available in Frax's until you rediscover them. Once the data source exists, it is possible to grant other roles access to it. This is done by clicking the Access button in the grid next to the relevant record. The data source access modal will open. The user granting access to the data source can only link roles for organizations to which they themselves have access. To add a role, simply select the arrow next to the relevant record in the Available Roles column. This action will move the record to the currently linked roles column. The Save button will become active. Select it. Over the life cycle of a data source, changes to it, for example the addition of tables or columns, will result in the data source having to be rediscovered in Legoz. These changes may have an impact on data objects created from that data source. By selecting the Validate Data Source button, a process is kicked off where every data object that is linked to the data source will be automatically validated. This action opens the background jobs screen, where you can view the results of the validation exercise by clicking the Detail button next to the record in the grid. Information regarding any data object that failed in the validation process can be viewed by selecting the icon in the error column. The icon will only display if an error was encountered. This information can then be used to correct any errors. In this example, the validation process was successful. The final step after creating and discovering the data source is to view and interrogate its entities, attributes, and relationships. This subject will be discussed separately in the Data Source Management, Entities, Attributes, and Relationships video. Thank you for watching. Catch you in the next one.